Hello and welcome to the Fair Play podcast. I'm Tom Pimenta, a member of the sports team here at Pennington's Manchester Cooper, and I regularly advise on discrimination issues. In this second series of this podcast, Going for Gold, we're looking at the road to becoming an elite athlete to try and understand what it takes to compete at the highest level of sport. We'll look at a range of stages in the pursuit of gold, from the discovery of talent, the training and the coaching process, getting funding needed to compete, qualification, the competition itself, and what next when an athlete is forced to give up their dream or take a different path. I'm joined by my co-host today, Eva McHale, who is also a member of our sports team and specialises in commercial and other sporting disputes.
Thank you, Tom. Our guest today is Pippa Britton OBE. Pippa's incredible career includes representing GB archery at 2 Paralympic Games, Beijing and London, having been part of their team for 15 years in total. She was also selected and represented the able-bodied Welsh archery team more than 20 times. Her accolades include reaching the podium on 6 consecutive World Championships and 24 international events. Pippa also achieved 11 world records along the way. In addition to her impressive achievements as an archer, she also branched out into governance in the sport. She was the first para-archery athlete to also be simultaneously on the committee for World Archery. She is a former vice chair of Sport Wales and is on the Aneurin Bevan University Health Board and is a board member of the British Paralympic Association. Pippa was awarded an OBE for her services to sport in June 2023.
Pippa's drive is not just about achieving excellent results in sport, but also promoting equity and inclusion, and aims to put well-being and fairness at the heart. Pippa has also been vice chair of UK anti-doping, as well as volunteering as a chair of Disability Sport Wales for Archery GB Wheelchair Advisory Group at International Rugby League, and was also an International Paralympic Committee anti-doping committee member. Quite an introduction. Thank you very much, Pippa, for coming in today to discuss your journey.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I often think that when I hear things like that, it sounds like you're talking about somebody else.
Wow, it's amazing to hear that you still have those thoughts and feelings at the level you've got to. So Pippa, can you just tell us a bit about what got you into archery in the first place? And I guess when you knew that it was more than a hobby?
Yes, and I think actually, although I didn't start archery when I was a little kid, I was quite competitive as a child, and I started off by swimming. In fact, I was born with a disability, and swimming was one of those things that I could do when there was a lot of other things that I couldn't do, and I had all sorts of hopes and dreams of being a big champion swimmer. But like lots of kids, I trained very hard, but actually I didn't make the grade, and so sport sort of took a lot of a back seat, I think, when I, went to college and, started work and all of those sorts of things. And then after I got married, my husband suggested that I might like to take up a hobby. And he just didn't know what he'd started, really. I tried archery. I wasn't very good at it, but I really, really liked it. And I liked the progression of archery, the fact that you can go out one day and you can score 50 points, and you go out the next day and you can score 60 points, and so on and so on. So you can actually see yourself getting better. And I'm one of those people that if I try something, I always want to try and be the best that I can be. And so there's that kind of attainment of perfection that sits around archery, getting the perfect score, which I think, it was just one of those things that I wanted to do. I was encouraged by my local club to enter some local competitions, and actually encouraged by all sorts of people along the way, the coach in the club, some of the people in local competitions who were shooting in bigger competitions said, oh, you should go to the county competition, or you should go to the British Championships. And I think for me, it was about that natural progression to start with. So yes, started as a hobby, but then my competitive side suddenly reared its head again.
And how big a role did your local community play in nurturing your initial interest?
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because the club that I joined In fact, the very first club that I went along to, I only went for one night to that club because I didn't feel that I got a particularly inclusive welcome. And then the next club that I went to, there was a lady there who had had polio when she was younger. And she'd actually competed for Britain. She'd been on the Welsh team. And her husband was the coach in the club. And he actually, I remember him saying one day that his wife had one leg and an outrigger. And I kind of felt like that very much myself at that point. I just felt included in the club. And I think that was another reason for me going back. Archery is actually quite a social sport because people walking backwards and forwards to the target, and they chat with each other. So you get quite a lot of that. But yes, it was just a really inclusive atmosphere, and I felt welcomed from the start. And I didn't feel that I was I was being excluded from any part of the club, and I think that's really important. So yes, it was a huge thing to feel part of the archery community.
Yeah.
No, it makes sense. I mean, to have found that, that environment in which you can obviously grow, develop, and as you say, go from getting 50 points, getting 60 points, and going from there. And obviously you got a lot more than 60 points as you progressed. I mean, your honours, obviously, incredible. Like I say from the introduction, I mean, your honours include, just looking at some of these here, making the podium at 6 consecutive World Championships, achieving 24 medals in 24 international events, and you broke many world and national records. I mean, what would you say? I mean, maybe perhaps it links to community. I mean, what would you say was the key to your sustained and continued success in that period?
I think there's always that pursuit of perfection. I think I was very lucky to have an extremely good coach, very supportive family, lots of wraparound medical support, physio support, all of those kinds of things. And I was really one of those people. I was just prepared to work very hard for what I wanted. I think mentally it becomes harder the longer you go on. Because when you first start, I think your whole focus is around you're wanting to win something that you've never won before. The first thing that you want to do is get the scores to be able to get onto the team in the first place. And then once you've done that and you get to your first championship, you want to do well, you want to win a medal. So your focus very much is about winning a medal. But after you've been successful for quite a long period of time, I think your focus starts to shift onto not losing rather than winning. And I think the altering your mindset around how you cope with the different kinds of pressure that changes throughout your career. And obviously, the longer you're at the top of the tree, the more people want to come along and knock you off. Yeah. And the other thing I would say I was really lucky was that, some of my medals are not individual medals, they're team medals. And I was extremely fortunate to have a really strong team that, sitting alongside me, and we did we've won some really great events.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's absolutely incredible is that you managed to maintain that success in your career despite having 2 major spinal operations in that period. And I think what our listeners would be really interested in is what your focus was during your surgery and recovery, and whether you ever thought that you might actually not come back from those operations and injuries.
Yeah, so that I think certainly the first surgery that I had, I mean, I couldn't pick up a bow for 6 months, and I mean that in itself, and then to be able to come back, I think it was a big change in my life, and before I had the surgery as well, I was walking but not very well, and then after the surgery, I became much more of a wheelchair user, started having to shoot from a wheelchair, so things changed dramatically. I went into World Championships about 6 months before I had the surgery, knowing the surgery was coming up. And at that point, I thought it would be the last time that I ever competed internationally. I didn't think there was any way that I was going to have a piece of surgery where they were going to insert a lot of metal in my back. And I mean, I've ended up, after the 2 lots of surgery, I've got 5 metal rods and 22 screws inside me. So that's quite a lot to take on. But I think for me, it was about I didn't want to give up on my dream completely. So that was the first thing, was although I feared I might never be able to shoot again, I didn't want to give up on it. So in all the time that I was unable to do anything, and where I wasn't allowed to do anything physical, where I couldn't lift a kettle almost, in all of that time, I focused very much on my mental resilience and also on doing a lot of visualization, because it's the one thing that you can do is you can visualize shooting arrows. And, I'm actually perfecting that part of your focus on how you're going to focus on shooting each arrow, because shooting a bow and arrow is like, you don't score the whole score. What you do is you score one arrow at a time, and you want each arrow to be perfect. And if every arrow was a 10, you'd get a perfect score at the end of the day. So when you visualize something, you can visualize shooting a perfect 10 every time. You don't actually make mistakes in visualization. So that was a really big part of what I was doing. And then as soon as I was able, my physio got me with very lightweight, elastic bands and those sorts of things. But it was still quite a scary moment when I first picked up a bow again at the end of that 6 months. And my surgeon had said, well, you can try a little bit of light shooting if you like. And that moment was, it was quite scary, I think, because I just didn't know whether or not I would be able to get back into it or not. And I didn't know whether I would hurt myself.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that afterwards you transitioned more into shooting from a wheelchair. So what did it take to adapt from being a standing archer to sitting on a stool and then competing in a wheelchair? How was that?
In some ways, it was something I should have done earlier, because my balance was very poor when I was a standing archer, which is how come I went onto the stool, and my balance wasn't 100% when I was sat on the stool either. So I probably should have done it earlier, but I was just a bit stubborn and big-headed, and I saw it as a negative thing, I think, at that point. I did see it as a negative thing. And in society generally, we find that there are people who view people with obvious visible disabilities there seems to be some kind of negative connotation. But actually, it was my coach who had the biggest impact on me, because he sat me down one day and he said, well, why don't you want to shoot from a wheelchair? And I was like, well, it'll feel like I'm giving up. That was, it was very much my attitude to it. And he said to me, yes, he said, but, a wheelchair is just a tool to do a job. And actually, that was something that really resonated with me. I suddenly started to view a wheelchair not as a symbol of disability, which is what we see it in society, but for me, it became a symbol of ability. So what I can do in a wheelchair is not what I can do without it. I can go places, I do still walk, but I use 2 sticks. So I can't walk very far, and I'm not very stable on my feet. But with a wheelchair, I can go virtually any distance I want to go. And it was something, that reduced my pain levels. It increased my stamina, all of those things, because it was helping me overcome some of my physical challenges. And it's as I said, it's, for me, it very much feels like a symbol of ability, of the opportunity to be able to do things.
I'm just really interested to know if you worked with a sports psychologist or anyone to help you with that sort of visualization technique that you mentioned earlier, but also to be able to change that view and that mindset.
Yes, and we did have we had a sports psychologist working with the team, and she and I worked together very closely. And in fact, there were all sorts of things that she did in, not just working with me on a one-to-one, but the team went away, for example, while I was in the middle of my recovery, and she got them all to send me a little message on video and those sorts of things, so that I still felt included as part of the team.
Yeah.
So, but I think the support staff around me through my time as an archer, I think, were the difference between, well, definitely, there's no thought about it, they were the difference between winning and losing. And, for example, I used to find if I went on long flights, I get a lot of spasm. And my sports massage therapist worked with me in terms of, well, what treatment do we give you before a flight so that we reduce that? And how long in advance of a flight do we do it? So that all of those things, it's a small thing, isn't it? But I mean, it's how do you work out all of those things? Do you need it 12 hours in advance, 24 hours in advance, 36 hours in advance? Because when you land, you'll get one day perhaps, and then you'll be into official practice. So you can't afford to have 3 days where you're trying to recover from the flight. Yeah. So those things, you don't often come across athletes talking about them, but actually that's the difference between a good performance and a bad performance. And that's about surrounding yourself with a really great group of people.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, I suppose, with the linking on some level, seeing the wheelchair as a tool for you to use for your archery, but also using the resources of the individuals as well, as a similar tool to help you get to that point. I mean, it's interesting, particularly the point about you're saying there about timing the flight in a similar way to what many people will do, trying to peak at the right point with competition. It's really interesting to hear you talk about that, but it makes complete sense given the tight time frames for all these kind of international competitions. And obviously there's quite a big international competition going on at the moment, and you've been in 2 Paralympic Games. I mean, how did it feel with going back to those, say, visualizations or trying to get that perfect score? I'd imagine the ultimate goal, I suppose, was to go to these Paralympic Games and to do these things. How did it feel to compete at those games? And obviously, particularly the one 2012 in your home games. Yeah.
Yes, it's completely different experience when you're away or when you're in a home games. I think it's my first games. I think I was unbelievably proud when they lit the flame. I suddenly turned into a small child who wanted to go swimming again. There was just that kind of whole feeling of almost disbelief that you work so hard and then you get there. And actually, it was I got beaten in Beijing by somebody who was just better than me. I was quite distraught because I really felt that I had a great chance of winning a medal. And you get so many heightened emotions around all of these things, and we'll see it over the next 2 weeks, and then we'll see it in the Paralympics. You work so hard for it. We've seen people already come forth, and it's agonizing, and I think it's difficult sometimes to sit back and enjoy the experience that you've worked so hard to achieve, because you're so focused on your performance and wanting to win a medal, because that's what you think about, because you plan 4 years out for it. A home games is an entirely different experience, because as well as trying to focus in on a medal, there's also the kind of external pressure from friends and family who want to get tickets to come see you. There's external pressure from the media because it's home games, and the whole atmosphere is completely different. But it's probably one of the proudest moments of my life still is going out in the opening ceremony at the Paralympic Games in London with all the gold ticker tape raining down, and it just gives me goosebumps even thinking about it. There is something quite extraordinary. And I do remember when I was going into the arena for a match and hearing my voice hearing my name in the crowd, and you know how you pick up on it when somebody says your name. And I looked up into the stands and I saw my mother's next door neighbour, and and I didn't even expect to see her there. So things like that, just completely different. But once you're actually onto the field of play, then you just have to trust the process. If you trust the process, you've trained and trained and trained and trained, and if you get that process right, if you shoot every single arrow in the best way that you can shoot it, then you never have anything to beat yourself up about, because you couldn't possibly do any better.
Yeah. I honestly feel emotional just talking to you about your experience at the games and get shivers down my spine. So I can't imagine what it was like for you. But you represented GB as a Paralympian and the Welsh able-bodied team on more than 20 occasions. Do you think that your sport is quite unique in that you could compete as both a Paralympian and an able-bodied athlete? And do you think there's scope for many other sports to have such inclusion?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? And they say that archery is a sport for all, so it doesn't matter, if you're 8 or if you're 80, or there's a bow for you out there, and you have a whole range of people. You have disabled people and people who don't have disabilities all on the shooting line at the same time. So it is a sport that can quite easily be adapted, and in fact there are very few disability specific competitions worldwide, let alone in Britain. So if you want to compete, you just compete on a shooting line with anybody else. So I would hesitate to say that our sport is unique, because that suggests it's the only sport that you can all be in the same place at the same time. And I mean, there's all sorts of things. I've spoken about swimming already, and we're not, maybe you're not going to be competing in the same competitions, but you can certainly all get in the swimming pool at the same time. So if it's, if it's just a club, and lots of sports have got variations, which are, it doesn't matter whether you're playing golf or cricket or tennis. There are lots and lots of variations of wheelchair versions or disability versions or walking versions or whatever they happen to be. So I think that that archery is not a unique sport. I think what tends to set it a little bit apart is because people don't have a disability specific competition most of the time, is people get just absorbed into the local clubs and into local communities. And that's the challenge with some sport, is that we don't do inclusion very well. And you get some sports like wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby league, for example, where actually you have both disabled and non-disabled people all using wheelchairs, all playing at the same time. They're great sports for families to get involved with, where you've got perhaps one child who has a disability and one who doesn't, and they can both play wheelchair basketball. So there are sports that do inclusion. And I think that the biggest challenge to inclusion within sport generally comes down to the assumptions that people make. So you find there are clubs that say, sorry, we don't have a disabled toilet, or we've got a step into the clubhouse, or whatever it happens to be. And they end up excluding people rather than having the conversation with the person who wants to be included and seeing whether or not they can find a workaround. So my archery club in Cwmbran, it wasn't the friendliest place in terms of being accessible. There was a step up to the field from the car park, and the disabled toilet was the largest toilet there that the janitor used to keep his cleaning things in. It was a dual purpose room. But what made the difference for me and for many other people in various clubs is the people in the club were prepared to go the extra mile. So whenever I turned up, I would open the boot of my car and somebody would get my equipment out for me and take it up onto the field. Somebody would walk backwards and forwards to the target and collect my arrows for me. So it's the people that make the difference, even though the facilities weren't as good as they might have been.
Yeah.
And you think about women's football, girls' football, actually, traditionally there's been a whole, where do girls go to the toilet? So girls can get excluded from some of those sports that take part on a pitch somewhere, because, boys will go to the toilet behind a bush and girls can't, that kind of, So there's something, isn't there, about, we're not just talking about disability here. That's just on a fundamental level of facilities that we need to improve things. I'm not saying we don't need to improve things, but it's about how people make you feel when you're trying to get included that's most important.
It makes sense in terms of, as well, the people being at the heart of that, and it's, someone's kind gesture, without necessarily thinking. They might just do that by default for anyone, and it just makes a difference from your perspective. I mean, do you think that sort of thing is key to how perhaps the perception of disabled athletes has perhaps changed in the time that you've competed? I mean, particularly in, as reference more recently to there was a whole range of really positive adverts around London 2012 about, this is an okay question to ask, this one isn't, just being open about it. I mean, what do you think's been, what do you think has changed about the perception of disabled athletes, disability and ability in the time that you competed?
Yeah, that's a how long's a piece of string question. We could probably talk for hours just about that. And I do think perceptions have changed, but there are also an awful lot of people who are not involved in elite sport who are really not having a good time. And actually, every time you are off the field of play, then you're still trying to encounter life and encountering, no drop curbs, or wanting to go out for a meal and not finding they've got, you can even get into the restaurant because there's, steps. Or if I go to London, for example, I've got a very short list of hotels that are really accessible, as opposed to those that say they might be. And so daily life is a challenge for everybody. I don't know if you saw the Sophie Morgan documentary on Channel 4 about the right to fly, but how many people's wheelchairs get damaged on flights and mobility equipment, etc. So I think we still have a very long way to go. We have the Equality Act in this country. It's been in place since 2010, which is quite a long time, and yet it doesn't seem to have the teeth that you would hope that it has. And I think that's what people encounter on a daily basis, is the challenge of just life. I think that attitudes are starting to change, but it still feels very, very slow. And of course, the infrastructure that surrounds us is what disables us, really. A whole kind of social model of disability, where we don't have universal design. And actually, if you just put a ramp into every building, anybody could use it. And that would include, elderly people and delivery drivers with a parcel on a sack truck, and people with wheelie suitcases, and small children. It doesn't matter who you are, something that you perceive is for a small portion of the population. You put it in place, actually, it is better for a large portion of the population. And we often don't think of it in that way. So people still think of things for surrounding disability as being an add-on or something special, rather than making them part of the heart of design, so they just become the norm. And that's where I think we are really quite a long way away from there. But as an individual, when I'm at a railway station, or if I'm on a train, there will inevitably be somebody saying, "Oh, are they there with the ramp? Do you want me to get somebody?" And I don't think that's what I would have encountered 20 years ago. I think people would have been a lot less willing to make that kind of offer. So I do think attitudes are changing. I think it's a bit slow, but it's the whole infrastructure that really is lagging behind, shall we say.
Actually, really interesting. That brings to mind the story of a campaigner I've read recently. He's a visually impaired man who's campaigning against these shared cycle and bus lanes. So it's where I think particularly in London, you have a bus stop for people to sit at, then a cycle lane, and then the buses pull in. And this visually impaired man was saying it's a recipe for disaster basically for us. But also, as you've just put it, that doesn't only affect potentially visually impaired people, but also maybe elderly people who are slower getting to the bus or something like that. And it amazed me that those sort of planning committees haven't, got the advice and recommendations of disabled people and other groups of people. So yeah, it's clear that we've still got a long way to go.
Yes.
So changing tack slightly, from your experience as an elite athlete, you then went on to have a number of committee and board level roles at a wide range of sporting bodies. What made you want to get involved in the governance side of sport?
Well, I think I was encouraged in the first instance. I was encouraged by my performance director to stand for the para archery representative at World Archery, and I was lucky enough to get voted in by the archery population across the world. And I went to my first committee meeting. At the time I went to my first committee meeting, there was a category that we had that was for men only. And, and we're not talking 50 years ago here, it's relatively recent. Mm. And I asked the question of the committee in my very first meeting, why there wasn't a women's category. And the response that I was given by somebody was that there weren't enough women. And it sounds extraordinary, but it is a category where typically there are higher incidence of men with a particular type of disability. So, but I turned around and I said, well, if you don't have a category, then you won't have any women. And I think, it was really that point, I think, was the point at which I realized that if you actually want anything to change in life, you can't just sit on the sofa and complain about it. You have to get involved. And so if you want something to, I say to people, if you want something to change, you need to be in the room where the decisions are being made. Having come through being an athlete representative, my whole focus was, if the rules are going to change, how's that going to affect the athletes? And so I was able to see a really clear link between what we were talking about, what was being decided, and how people would feel about that, and whether it would be a good thing, whether it would be a bad thing. And I think that's stayed with me. So when I retired from sport, I decided that I was really interested in that whole kind of line of work, but it's still, in the health board, I'm constantly coming back to the fact that if we do something that spends a lot of money in the boardroom in the health board, is that going to make a difference to how long someone has to wait for an ambulance, or is it going to make a difference to how quickly somebody can get a hip? So it's about remembering that everything that you do in the boardroom is all about the people that you're trying to have an impact for and improve outcomes for. And I see that quite a strong link between the two. And I'm not sure that that's always true for everybody in governance, but for me, that's what's really important. And I know that, as I said, if I just sit on the sofa and complain that things aren't going the way that I want them to go, nothing's ever going to change by me just sitting there complaining, is it?
I mean, you mentioned about, get yourself in the room, make your point, try to get, real change there. But once you're in that room, once you are making a point, what challenges have you faced when trying to provide fairness to competitors?
Yeah, I think it's not, well, one of the things I found out is it's not enough just to have an opinion.
Yeah.
It really isn't enough just to have an opinion. You need to have some evidence as well. And I think that's one of the things that I've found. I think I've been very lucky. I think in sport, generally speaking, people are very accepting of whether or not they're not worried if you've got a disability or if you're a woman, or, you know, and I think traditionally some of those boardroom roles, people can feel a little bit sidelined. It's important to be able to state your case and to be able to back it up with something. And I learned that quite early on, because I did discover that if you don't have anything to back it up with, people will dismiss you. And I think, but that's partly on me, isn't it? That's about me learning that that's the way in which people operate. And so yes, there have been one or two occasions where I had felt dismissed, but then I just felt, well, that's something else that I need to work towards, is to be actually saying, well, you know, okay, so you have dismissed me by saying, oh, we haven't got enough women, so, you know, that's an end to it. But that's that point, I need to say, well, hang on a second, I'm going to go out to all of these people that I know internationally, and I'm going to speak to them and say, if you had a category, how many women would you have in your country? And how many women would you have in your country? And then you can go back and you're armed with the facts, and then that's indisputable. Yeah. And I think that's the thing for me, is, you know, is learning what battles to pick and how to fight them.
Sounds remarkably similar to you describing visualization and improving on your scores. I mean, is that something you'd use in that context as well with this?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's probably a personality trait, actually, that you know, because it's just another way of being the best at what you do. It's just that in governance, you're trying to be the best at what you do for the benefit of other people. Whereas in sport, very often you're trying to be the best that you can be just because you want to have a medal put around your neck. So it feels slightly more selfish.
We're told, I think, as lawyers, to go to the bathroom and do power poses before meetings, but now I'm going to try and add some visualization into that as well. So Tom and I have acted for athletes on classification challenges, and I know Tom does that quite regularly. How well do you think the current classification methods for disabled athletes work, and what would you suggest could be done to improve them?
Yeah, and that's another of those questions, isn't it, where there's, you know, we could end up talking about it for, you know, considerable amount of time. Obviously, there are new changes to the code, the classification code coming in, and some of that is around consistency. And I think it's always really important to remember with classification is that it's not as simple as I have a disability, therefore I get a classification. It's all down to how your disability affects your ability to do a particular kind of sport. Yeah. And the example that I say to people that makes it very simple indeed is that I'm not going to be taking part in any visually impaired sport anytime soon, because I can see just fine. Yeah. And you know, and so it's that in its simplest form is the heart of classification, is that it's about, you know, how does my disability affect my ability to do archery? And that is what my classification is based on. But of course, we have a number of eligible impairments as well. And the list of eligible impairments has been designed so that if you have something that's a fluctuating condition, so that you could be effectively almost able-bodied one day, but you might be, you know, actually really badly affected another day. How can you tell on the day of the competition which you're going to be? And there are things like pain conditions, for example, which are excluded, because again, you know, what happens if there's treatment, or what happens if you have a good day, what happens if you have a bad day, how does it affect your ability to train as well as compete, all of those things. So I think it's very difficult to set a kind of basic standard to start with before you go any further with classification. And then you need to think about all of the different sports. Some sports have classifiers where the classifiers don't have a medical background. Other sports insist you do have to have a medical background, and that is on a sport by sport basis. Some of them it's about observation on the field of play. Some of them it's more about, you know, testing in a kind of medical environment. I think for me, the thing that will make the biggest difference is if we can find some way to standardize some of this, so that we're not getting variations. And you think about Paralympic sport, it's actually, it's pretty new, isn't it, really? You know, it's not been around that long. There's lots of sports that have had to work out whole classification systems, and they've relied on volunteers in the past to do classifications. And certainly in the really early days of Paralympic sport classification, there was a feeling of wanting to include everybody. So perhaps looking on classification in the most lenient way. And now we're in a situation where across the world, Paralympic sport is viewed as sport. It's viewed as sport. There's funding, there's support, there's sponsorship, there's all sorts of things that never existed in the past. And now it's all about making sure that it's fair treatment of athletes, so that if you've got 10 athletes in a competition, they are all affected in a comparable way, so that the outcome of the competition is as fair as possible. So we are on a journey, as they say, but I think we need to move into a space where we need to think about, are there sports that are very similar where we could have a multi-sport classification? And if that's true, then that might aid consistency as well, because you would have a smaller group of people doing the classifications. Whether or not we'll have to move into classifiers being accredited in some way by the International Paralympic Committee, those sorts of things might come in the future, again, so that we make sure that everybody's operating to the same rules and the same standards.
Yeah.
And that's not easy to do at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of challenges within that, but I think, as you mentioned, obviously, it's about having those conversations, it's about debating it, and it's about arguing the point and listening to others as well. I mean, looking back at one of the sort of massive moments, I think I've when looking at your past, really, it's you've been described as Wales' best archer, and you're awarded the OBE for services to sport in the King's Birthday Honours in June 2023. How did it feel hearing that comment, Wales' best archer, and also obviously being awarded an OBE?
I don't know if I am Wales's best archer. I think I'm probably one of the only one of the very few people who've managed to do that crossover between able-bodied and disabled sport, which I think is it is quite unusual. Not as unusual as Nerily Fairhead from New Zealand, who competed in both the Olympics and the Paralympic Games. And I'm not certain when that was, but I think 80s or 90s, something like that. But yeah, quite an incredible achievement. The OBE, I was totally floored. I have to say, I was so surprised. I was delighted. I mean, why wouldn't you be delighted? Mm-hmm. But I was really surprised because I'm no longer competing. So I've moved into a world of governance. You kind of feel like a little bit like what you do is I'm going to say under the radar almost, but you're trying to make a difference to people's lives, but you don't really think anybody's going to spot that you're doing it. And so I still don't know. I still don't know who nominated me, but I was absolutely delighted. And I think I feel it's a little bit of a reflection as well on my wider support network, the people beyond the people who were in my immediate team, but things like, my best friend and my husband and my brother and my mother and all of those people, who gave up time with me, or who, I missed my goddaughter's christening. Those sorts of things that you can't do anything about, that you've sacrificed or you give up. And it's not, those sacrifices are the things that other people give up for you as well. They stay behind and keep the house going, or they just listen to you endlessly going on about, should I have 110 grains in my arrow point? Should I have 120? When they don't know anything about archery. And actually that's part of your support network as well.
Modest as ever, owing the OBE to other people, but completely take your point that it takes a village, I guess. So looking ahead to the exciting near distant future, Paralympics GB's archery squad for Paris 2024 includes Tokyo 2020 gold medalist Phoebe Patterson-Pine and Jodie Grinham, who is just a trailblazing female athlete who will be 28 weeks pregnant when competing, which is just incredible. What do you think about their prospects for the Games, and do you have much involvement with them now?
I don't have very much involvement with them now, although I have to say I am, I shouldn't say it, I know, but I'm absolutely rooting for Jodie, because when I was still on the team, I was also coaching on the development squad, and Jodie came through on the development squad, and I did some really early coaching with her when she first came in. So plainly, I watch her career with interest all the time. I'm always really keen to. She's a lovely, lovely person, and always really keen to see how she does. And Phoebe's a lovely person as well. And in fact, I was in Tokyo when she won gold, and she was brilliant. You know, she was just so cool and calm and collected on the line. She did an amazing job, and I think it's going to be really difficult for her, because once you're trying to defend a title, we're back to that kind of different. You've got to have a different all of a sudden. So, but I mean, obviously, I wish them all like every success. But Jodie, of course, you know, is well, she's doing something that nobody else has done. I know she will have had to make some tweaks to her technique.
Yeah.
I know she's had to make some tweaks to her belt, because she was saying that the belt that holds her quiver up, she's had to make some changes there. But I'm looking forward to seeing her compete. She's looking in great shape. Yeah. And yes, as I said, I will be looking on with a tiny little bit of pride. She does all the hard work. It's nothing to do with me, is it? But you know, it's really great to see people, and I will be out there as I'm on the chairing the jury of appeals, so I won't be able to cheer anybody on apart from secretly.
Watching on your phone under the table.
I need to remain impartial.
No, I mean, thank you. I mean, it's been incredible. I think there's so many angles and so many aspects of what you've achieved in your career that really anyone in any walk of life can really look up to. I mean, what would you like prospective Olympic and Paralympic hopefuls to take from your story or your stories?
I think that there are a few things. I think you should always dream big, and but the biggest thing for me, I think, has been just sticking at it when there have been setbacks. Because if you look at somebody like Kelly Holmes, for example, Dame Kelly Holmes, you know, famous, long history of injury and never quite getting there. And then all of a sudden, you know, she just keeps sticking at it and she gets 2 gold medals. There's something, isn't there, about that kind of, you know, don't give up on your dreams and keep working hard at it. But I think the biggest thing that I would say is to think about your future after sport, because things will change. And the best thing that we can do is keep people from sport in sport, whether they want to go into coaching, whether they want to go into governance, or whether they just want to run their local club and bring kids on. I think it's about thinking about what do you want to do with your future, but don't neglect or lose the skills that you've learned along the way. So all those skills you need for really top level performance are things that will help you achieve any dream or any goal in your life. And it's about how do you transfer those things, you know, the time management that you learned, or the working with a team, or whatever it happens to be. All of those things that you learn are useful to you your whole life through. So even once you've transitioned out of sport, you shouldn't just go, oh, well, that's my past. You know, you should be able to carry it forward with you.
Yeah, I mean, don't know about you either. I'm definitely very much pumped for my afternoon of work now. I think this is, and it was incredible. I think thank you so much for your time and sharing your experiences with us.
It's my absolute pleasure. It's been really nice chatting to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll be writing a follow-up article on some of the issues raised during this podcast. But if you have any questions or want to discuss this further, please contact us on our Sports Podcast email address at sportspodcast@penningtonslaw.com, or you can get in touch with me or Eva. Thank you.
Thank you.